thank you all for joining me today on World Day for Cultural Diversity. I'm Nina Manku and I'm Head of Accountancy and Tax Design at Kaplan. I'm also the lead on embracing our diversity microsites, which go out to our learners, giving them a range of topics that they can actually have a better and clearer understanding on. Each month I update these pages, and what I've learned as an individual is that there's so much to learn around cultures, around diversity, and about feeling included. And so today I've got lined up a number of guests who are going to share their experiences around dialogue and development and how we can really improve our thought processes and our mindsets. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you our guest who's joined us from Goldman Sachs. So we've got Lin Yu. She's an executive director at Goldman Sachs as an asset manager. Now, Lin inspired me. I attended a networking event some months ago, and she was the guest speaker there, and she spoke about so many different topics, and it was just so engaging and so interesting to understand her background and how she was made to feel when she came over from China. Lin is not only the Heroes Women role model in 2019, she's also part of the Chinese Business Leaders Network as well, and she's currently the president of the Rising Network in London. I've also got Amani Ali. She's a financial analyst at Microsoft. Now, Amani is a Kaplan apprentice, and again, with Amani, I had a connection through a project that I'm leading on called Apprentice of Our Time. Now, Amani spoke to me about her cultures and her values, and as soon as she started having these conversations with me, our dialogue and our developed even further and further, and we were just deep in conversation. And so I thought she would make a fantastic guest on today's webinar. I'm also joined by Kerr Lewis. Now, Kerr is a development tutor. He's a training and development tutor at Kaplan, and he's also the co-chair for Kaplan's EDI committee. Now, Kerr has so much to share. He is just, again, so inspirational. He's grown his network from working in retail to coming into kind of Kaplan and training our talent coaches, and he's again has so much to share. So without further ado, please do send in your questions. We'll be more than happy to get them answered by any one of our guests, and we'll respond back to you personally. So do get in touch. You can also get in touch with myself either via LinkedIn or through the Eventbrite page as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's session, and hopefully you'll take something away from this. So diversity and inclusion doesn't start with me, it doesn't start with you, it starts with everyone. I've got some questions, and the reason why I wanted to ask you these questions is because I attended an event about 6 months ago, and literally I was blown away with your answers, and I was just like, good for you, Lin. You've done so well. You've got such a strong network, and you've really made a presence in terms of like making sure that diversity and inclusion is kind of out there, and people are having those conversations. And obviously this year's theme is around dialogue and development. And it's so important that everyone hears what we've got to say. So, what does diversity mean to you? And are you able to give me any practical advice for our audience?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be able to kind of share some of my experience and my perspectives. Because I think on the topic of diversity, it can be regarded as like a political correct term or a social of issue of social justice, and then it's often debated in vague terms. Often in business, I get the sense that people get this feeling that this is one of the things they have to do. So like, oh, a diversity training, you have to tick the box. It's something that is almost imposed on people. And what's worse is that sometimes it can backfire as well. So, much of the kind of unconscious biases trainings that can almost provide an excuse for certain people when they behave poorly, because they can say, look, it's unconscious, so it can't be my fault. And even with the best intentions from people, there are some studies that found that after diversity training, people can behave worse.
Yeah.
And why is that? It's because they felt like they've ticked the box, they've done their bit, they've done the training, and this gives them the permission to do what they want. It's that kind of moral licensing. So
Yeah.
I think it's through my work, I found the number one question that people ask about diversity is this. We have done a lot of diversity training. We feel so energized by the topic. We want to do something, but what can we really do on a day-to-day basis? And I found this to be true myself, right? I went to a great talk, being so inspired by the speaker. Then I got back to my desk and I start checking emails. And a few hours later, as if nothing has ever happened.
Yeah.
So I think through my own experience learning about diversity, experiencing diversity as a minority, on the gender and ethnic minority category, I've discovered a few surprises that I think it makes diversity much more integrated into our day-to-day lives. The first one is this. I think there are areas that we don't think too much about, but actually can be the core of what diversity is about. Sometimes the most innocent activity could be quite relevant. I love this example that I've learned. It's about Friday night drinks. So we don't have that in China, but nevertheless, that's something I've learned and picked up on coming here. So say your boss likes to take people out on drinks, for drinks on Friday, as this is a team bonding experience. So immediately, this is seemingly thoughtful act includes certain people and excludes others. Let's have a think about who are they, the people who are excluded. I mean, there are people who are not going for religious reasons, say Muslims who don't drink, Jewish people who go home for Friday night dinner. And then there are the people who are parents, right? They have childcare responsibilities, or people who have to care for elderly parents. They can't come. There are people who might have a very long commute and don't really want to stay up very long on a Friday night. And then, there are like recovering alcoholics. I just, I don't think it's a very good idea for them to be near the drinks. So, and then perhaps for us, for cultural reasons, right? So the Chinese people, we would rather sit down for a meal than standing up all night, starving to have a drink.
I know.
I myself find it a terrifying experience, going out with my colleagues, not only that keeping up with their drinking is very challenging, but I think more scarily is honestly, I didn't think I have enough to sustain interesting conversations all night. So what is a supposedly bonding experience created a real sense of isolation for me. But not until that, obviously, I got much better at drinking, which seems to be quite the asset. But again, my point here is this manager's perfectly good impulse to create a strong team turns into a subtle advantage for people who can participate on a continuous basis, and the disadvantage for those who can't. And ultimately, I think this Friday night drinks is about access. It's access to your managers, to your colleagues that you might not have during a normal working environment. But it can be a dividing activity. So, a number of things that can be done here. As individuals, we can create other opportunities to engage with our peers, have one-on-one meetings. You don't have to force yourself to go to the drinks if you don't want to. But equally, I think even more importantly for managers, for the firm, it's critical to think of a variety of activities to include everyone and not just relying on this one thing. So that's number one. I think, there are areas that are seemingly very innocent, but actually could be quite related to diversity. The second element I've found, is for individuals, we can leverage what we have learned from the diversity training and reframe it as a part of our professional development. So for example, often a key step in relation to diversity is to have this awareness and hearing others' perspectives. I think this can be a gateway to access our self-awareness, meaning, if I know where they are coming from, I also know how I'm likely to be perceived. So for example, say in terms of this communication styles, I came from a country that is very indirect, subtle, high context, where the company that I work for is American. Many of my colleagues' styles are much likely to be direct, low context. So with that understanding, that can certainly help me become more effective in communicating and help me become like better leaders.
Yeah.
And then the last piece that you touched on, I think is really what surprises me most, is this learning really not just can draw parallels into the business life, but also my personal lives as well. So yes, I am on maternity leave with my second child. So my first child, he is 3. So, when they're 2 or 3, like all the parents around the world, I felt, out of depth from time to time, understanding their behavior. So I turned to what I know alongside complaining together with other parents, by the way. I read a lot of books, I listened to a lot of talks. So after about the 20th books I read, I started to see some common themes for this. That is for a child to thrive. Empathy is ultimately very, very important. It's about, putting yourself into their situation and understanding their perspectives. And related to that, you also need to create an environment that he feels safe, an environment he feels belong. So when he's not afraid or worried, then he will have the energy to explore the world as he should be. So when I read all of these, then I was like, hang on a second, isn't this exactly the same thing I talked about in relation to diversity? It is about that psychological safety. It is about that belonging. So when we don't question whether we belong to a workplace, then that's when we can be most creative, we can be most productive, we can be most of ourselves. So, and then also, if you can understand the 3-year-old, be empathetic and see their point of view, there is no reason you cannot see that from people who are different to you, be it from gender or from race or from whatever difference that is. You have it in you to understand them if you can understand your 3-year-old child. So I guess to me, diversity provides this learning that not only helped me professionally, but also at a personal level. And I think the advice I would have for people is think it much more broadly and make it work for you.
Yeah, no, that's excellent advice, and it's instilling that in any age. So from a very small child right through to adulthood,
Oh, no.
it's so important. It's just making sure people understand. So, what makes up the dimensions of diversity and inclusion in your eyes, would you say?
When we often talk about diversity, I think typically we're referring to that kind of demographic diversity. Those are the categories that you often have: race, gender, age, class, sexual orientation, religion, for example. But I think, it's fair to say that we're not entirely defined by those demographics. And but it's important to remember that we are all respond to individuals who are different to us. It's just some of those differences that are more visible, some of them are invisible and harder to see. So to give you some examples, on say physical appearance. So when we look at people, their hair, their body type, weight, or dress, and then we quickly assess them fairly or unfairly based on those traits. So if you look at the Fortune 500 CEOs, over 60% of them are over 6 feet. That's 4 times the number in the general population. I have read a lot of literatures on leadership, and I have not seen any research that correlates leadership ability to one's bone structure. But nevertheless, we see a tall man walking into the room, we're likely to think, that's a leader.
He must be, yeah.
Yeah, what it indicates here is there's an archetype of what we think leaders look like. So if you look like the archetype, you're assumed to be a leader until you are proven not. Whereas for others, it's assumed that you are not a leader until you prove you are. And there's a big difference between those tailwinds and headwinds. We know the career advancements can come into accumulation of small advantages or disadvantages. I think there is a Google study showing just a 10% bias against Black professionals reduce their probability of getting to the top by a massive 90%. So this archetype matters, and we need to be aware, and then really to challenge it. Some of the other elements are also in relation to, say, people's background, the social economic status. One of my Chinese friends told me this when she first joined this British investment bank. Her manager said this to her. She said, oh, we're a very diverse team here. We have women, we have Chinese, we also have people from the North. Look, I don't have any comments on that divide between the North and the South in the UK, but I think it just highlights that dimension about, where you are from, and then, that kind of socioeconomic status that is often implied. The other example, probably the final one that I will go into a bit more, is this. So I work in, and like many of you that work in finance industry. So this asset management industry of ours, this nature of roles that who is going to what could be actually quite dividing. So, if I often ask people, what would be the hardest roles to get into an asset management company? Typically people would think, got to be the portfolio managers, right? They're the people who manage the money. That is very hard. And then that's, yes, it's hard to get into. But there is also something else that has one of the highest barriers to enter. And that is client-facing professionals in this industry. So I guess, in order to be client-facing, there is an implied level of gravitas. It's a level of sophistication, a polishedness that you need. So in other words, you need to know what you're doing when you take a client to a restaurant, or you need to know how to have a small talks to build the relationships. So that's a barrier, especially for people of underprivileged backgrounds, because that's not something that can be easily picked up by just passing exams and having good grades.
That's it. Yeah.
So I think there are many things to consider. In fact, there are studies that have shown there are minimum 31 dimensions of such differences at work. So for example, within the work itself, that you have the office locations. So are you in the headquarters, or are you in a satellite location? For us working for an American company, the further you are away from New York, what does that mean for you in terms of your career? And then there's your divisions, right? Are you revenue generating, or are you in a supporting function? And what do people really think of each other? Then we talked about maybe styles. So there are the kind of personality styles, very generally speaking, the extroverts versus introverts. There are the behavior styles. So you might think of, the framework of director, creator, thinker, planner. It's just an example of the different styles that we will have. And there are also other demographical factors. For example, there's generational differences. So that's a very big one, right? What do the millennials really think of the baby boomers? And vice versa. So, and then also the family status. So before I had kids, for example, I couldn't stand conversation about children. I felt like if you show me your child's photo one more time, I will literally just walk out of the door. But obviously now with
it's the topic children, of choice.
That's all I talk about. But I realized for our people, like the analysts on our team who don't have children, that could be very dividing. They wouldn't know what that means. So I guess to answer your question, the diversity really extends beyond the obvious categories. So we need to dig a lot deeper than the demographic diversity. And there are some seemingly irrelevant examples that are actually very related. So it's not just about the policy, the training, it is really every bit of our work life.
So, what guidance can you give to help improve dialogue in organizations? So, you've touched on some of the points, but is there anything in particular like you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that this is something that it needs to work from the individual level, from the team level, and also from the organizational level. And then I think it's probably best to illustrate this with an example. Again, I will just share some of my own experience because for the Western companies, especially for the American ones, the greatest belief, the general belief is very much this squeaky wheels get the grease. But in our culture, the Chinese, the East Asian culture, we believe the opposite to be true. That is, this loudest duck gets shot. And then I certainly remember that when I was first month into the job, I was called into this meeting room by my manager at the time. He said, Lin, I've noticed something. You seem to have really good ideas one-on-one. How come you never speak up at team meetings? So I was genuinely very shocked by the question because to me, it was very natural for me to pay respect to more senior people of the team. He said, well, I don't think it works like that. You need to speak up. So I did. I mean, the first few times I remember my heart was pounding so badly because it went against everything I've believed in. I was that duck that was about to get shot. And by the way, you might have seen some of those studies on the cultural belief with the Korean pilots, where there were a lot of accidents during the 80s, I think, when the co-pilot couldn't speak up to the captain because they are afraid of being that loudest duck. And then the outcome is they got killed. So it was that strong of that belief. And then that's how I think I felt that it was so uncomfortable to speak up because it really went against some very deep-rooted belief that we were raised about. But nevertheless, I persisted with that. And about 6 months later, I was called into the same meeting room by the same manager who said, Lin, I've noticed something. You spoke up and you showed me absolutely no respect now. And that was great. So I'm not suggesting anyone to disrespect their manager. I mean, it could be quite a dangerous career strategy, but I think what this is to highlight that something that is quite fundamental to diversity, because my experience is so different to my colleagues. In meetings, it could almost be in a parallel universe. So when I didn't say things in meetings, these three things are happening. One, I'm waiting for my cue to speak because I think, it's rude to talk over each other. Two, I'm paying my respect. So we don't want to be that loudest duck. And three, I don't want to give half-baked comments because we were told not to speak up until our answers were perfect. So it took me a very long time to understand how others think of me when I don't speak. And they also have those three things that happen at the same time. One, I don't have any views. Two, I am not confident or have poor communication skills. That's the number three. So those are the pretty damaging perceptions for a person in these organizations that we work for. But no one has decoded for me, but they just asked me to speak up. So I had several crises because of it, as you can imagine. But so I think many firms, are very committed to diversity. So what does it mean on a day-to-day level? How can we make diversity part of our business conduct, not just a training session that we attend? So I will share with you this framework that I have, which I mentioned that touch on the three levels. So the first thing is on this individual levels. I think understanding diversity helped me with my awareness, as I mentioned earlier. So now I realize if I don't speak up in meetings, I was told by my culture to behave this way. But my culture is not me, at least it's not me entirely. So I can have a choice. This is really quite important because I used to think there's something wrong with me. And I take it very personally. So this decoding of what influence our behavior can be very, very liberating. But at the same time, I also know when I don't speak out, how is that perceived by others? So with that awareness, I now can choose what to do. So it's important to highlight this is not about changing who I am, which is much, much harder. And I do not advise that at all because it goes against the principle of the psychological safety and belonging. But it's more about changing styles. It's modifying a set of behaviors depending on the situation, which we naturally do anyway. So now I take much more ownership about how I present myself, and then leveraging a fuller range of expressiveness. And then I guess, there's also on the team level, with this understanding of cultivating diverse thinking, I guess I'm also reaching out to my colleagues, to my team, to bridge the gaps in perceptions, because it's quite simple. If I don't share, how would they know? I think there is a responsibility to contribute to the diversity intelligence, sharing that perspectives so we can direct other perceptions on us, on how they should see us. But at the same time, this is also about being open and taking a risk of being vulnerable here. And that is also very important, to form a sense of that psychological safety as a leader of our business. And I guess very lastly is at this organizational and the industry level, because the key is really to appreciate that diversity, inclusion, and belonging, there's three distinctive tasks. The diversity is the first step. That is for everyone to have a seat at the table. The second step is inclusion. That is about everyone has a voice. But the last step is belonging. That is for that voice to be heard. So I guess for me, I'm driving some industry changes in terms of understanding the Chinese professionals' perspectives. And then really, I think it's important that we have all of the three layers in mind, that we don't stop just one place, and then we work together to help drive these changes and make organizations much more inclusive.
Yeah, and those three layers are really kind of important to make sure that they're relayed in the right way and people understand everyone's kind of viewpoints. It takes me on to microaggression. Talk to me about what microaggression is and how we can change mindsets.
I think microaggressions, and then those are small behavior gestures, comments that really kind of minimize other people's experiences. To give you some examples that there are particular towards Black professionals, but really applies to anyone that is of the kind of ethnic minority category. So for example, when people say, when I see you, I don't see color. It sounds quite well-intentioned perhaps, but actually that is signaling this person who does not acknowledge your Blackness or colorness. They're denying that part of your identity. And there are things that people say like, we are all one race, the human race. And then again, is that wrong? I guess that is signaling that your experience as a Black person or a Chinese person is no different from the experience of people of others, and that again is really to denying that their experience. And then and this one, everyone can succeed in society if they work hard enough. And this is quite a popular one, right? And then I think that puts everything, the outcomes for the minority people completely result from the laziness, and then without taking into account of any historical, social, economic reasons. And I think, by the way, for Chinese professionals, there is one particular one that when we say something about our country that might be different to what you would have heard from the media, they would think that's what the government tells us to say, and which is entirely not true. It denies that we can think for ourselves. But nevertheless, I think a lot of the times that's what people have in their mind. So firstly, I think it's important to change the mindset is, if you can start to understand other people's experience and perspectives, then you naturally wouldn't say those things to the people. So I don't want microaggressions to be a list of things that you remember and you'll be like, oh, I mustn't say this, I mustn't say that. But actually is just the things naturally that once you understand where they come from, that wouldn't be appropriate things to say.
Yeah.
So, but there is another element of it that is the opposite of microaggression. It's called microactions. So these are the things that you can do to cultivate a sense of belonging and psychological safety. So very, very small things that we can begin with, such as use a colleague's names in conversation,
Yeah.
or once a month grab a coffee or lunch with a coworker you don't know well, reach out, take the opportunity to learn more about who they are and what they come from. And then when somebody joins a conversation, takes a moment to bring them up to speed. When they're interrupted, make a conscious effort to bring them back to the conversation. So I think, those are the small gestures that are completely opposite from the microaggressions. And then that can really help build that environment that people are open to share, and then to cultivate a sense of belonging.
Yeah, it's about making everyone feel included,
Mm,
and just opening up conversations with people. Like, I'm always interested in the Asian culture,
mm,
or I want to know more about the Jewish culture, and I
mm.
head up the Embracing Our Diversity microsite at Kaplan, and each month I change up the content, and then the amount of information that I didn't even know
Yeah,
related to certain cultures and things. It's been a learning experience for me, and this is why I'm so passionate about it, because I'm learning at the same time.
absolutely.
I'm also trying to make a difference, so everyone feels included, people are not scared. And I think that's where the barriers are. People always feel scared to speak up because they might offend somebody, and it's not about
Absolutely.
that. And that's where the mindsets, I think, have to change. So
Completely agree.
yeah, so if you were to change one thing relating to diversity, what would it be? Mine would be people speak up.
It's such a great question. And then you made such an excellent point. So
Yeah,
my point would be not in contrary to what you have said, but it's really in addition.
yeah,
It's really, I think it's also important to not put all the responsibilities on individuals,
yeah,
especially when they belong to certain diversity category.
yeah,
Because if you walk into an organization today and then you ask the leader, for example, how does inequality work? I don't think many would be able to tell you. So, but that's really
yeah,
what we're trying to fix. So I think I talked about one's height and then that association with being perceived as a leader, the concept of that architect. I just want to expand on this to make this point, because our organizations today are set up by and large to support an ideal type of worker to succeed. And the research have consistently shown that even across geographies, across different cultures, that this ideal type of worker is by and large a man.
mm,
So when we think about a manager, we will think of somebody that is male. It is not just male, but more likely middle class, straight male.
yeah,
And then we talked about those different dimensions of diversity. One area is style. So on this male style is someone who's typically willing to engage in a sort of dominant, assertive, aggressive, competitive, and exclusionary behaviors to get ahead. And then for the other kind of demographical factors that we mentioned about family, so these are the people who are much more likely to make work their number one priority. That means they're also somebody who's free from dependent care responsibilities. So these are what organizations are set up for. It wasn't with everyone in mind. So if you fit almost by default, you worked in, and then it's easier for you to access networks, to be sponsors, to see you as a leader simply because you fit with what the archetype when it comes to leadership. But the reverse is also true, right? So the more ways that you differ from this ideal standard, from all these
yeah,
categories, by the way, then the more challenges you're going to experience. when you're trying to advance at work. I mean, certainly as women, think about it. We when we have babies, that is in complete contrast of when the organizations were set up for people who are, free from, dependent care responsibilities. No wonder that we have such challenges. So I think it's unfair to put the responsibilities on people who just don't fit in the archetypes to change, because organizations are not set up for us in the first place. So, for example, you hear this advice like, I hear this myself, so don't be a victim. I think that's not technically wrong, but it's also put a responsibility on individuals not taking into account of this systematic oppression. So at the same time, I think as individuals, it's important to free ourselves from having to change, to make all the changes. So there are a lot of research on helping individuals to become smarter, more perceptive, more able to guard against biases, right? Like Daniel Kahneman, who, by the way, is the reason I study psychology, but his work is very much make us individuals feel better, smarter. But if I were to change one thing, I think is to see the issue also from the holistic, systematic perspective. So it's not just enough to lean in. It's also about changing the system.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So with the wisdom that you've acquired, what would you tell your 18-year-old self on how to succeed in the world of work?
Such a good question. If I think about 18 years old me, I would take you even further, because at the time when I was 18, I was in China. But I made up my mind about coming to the West when I was about 4.
Wow.
Because that was the first time I watched this Western TV advert. It was this Head and Shoulders shampoo advert. So I was completely intrigued by this advancement this commercial represented. So it was then, back then I said to myself, I wanted to see more of that. I wanted to be more of that world. So it was that same curiosity that got me through all of this, and then ended up, being in the UK. I guess because of our upbringing in China, if you look at the past 40 years, that's really the story of change, the story of success. I think the average speed of change for a Chinese person to experience, I think it's like 32 times that of GDP per capita, versus maybe 2 or 3 times in the US, which is quite a good number in the developed country. So what we were doing at the time is we were told to study and then follow the path to have a good job and then to kind of pursue that success. So with that mindset, with that belief, I thought after I've gone to Oxford, my life must be sorted from this point, because that's all I have heard. You go to a good university, that's it.
You've made it.
You didn't, right? Then I go to Goldman Sachs, and I thought, well, this time my life is finally sorted, surely, because all I need to do is work, and then life will take care of itself. It didn't either. So I guess the first thing I would say is that the career or your life is not a linear process like I thought it was. And secondly, it's especially with work, this is no longer a process that has right or wrong answers, especially like you can replicate from your exams learning. So, when I look back, being in the UK, working here, it has been such an enriching experience. That 4-year-old me, for example, when I stood in front of the TV, had a dream of being in the West. But I think that dream have evolved massively now, because it's no longer a dream that we have to live for our parents' expectations. It's no longer a version just to achieve success. I think it's a journey to discover ourselves, to find our voices with this sense of purpose, to define this emerging identity of our generation of the Chinese millennials, and really to inspire future ones. So that would be what I say to my 18-year-old, that you don't know what's ahead, and embrace yourself.
It's a big world out there. Oh, Lynn, you've been an absolute fantastic guest. You know, you've just inspired me, but you know, I really hope that our audience is able to take loads away from today. You know, your answers have just been fantastic, and it just shows how strong you are. And you know, carry on the great work because it's just fantastic. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great fun.
Do you feel you're making an impact as you're kind of developing your career as a
Yeah,
woman?
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. I would say so. It is embedded in Microsoft's culture to kind of reflect on the impact of prospective objectives before getting started. So having this approach means you're always thinking, having that thoughtful thinking before starting a task or even thinking to start a task. So like, for example, I've only been in Microsoft for 6 months. And in this short amount of time, I've managed to implement and lead a design of a month-end flash. And what that is just high-level insights into the business that is sent out to the senior leadership team. This was adopted by other regions too. So that has the impact of enabling all recipients to kind of reach business discussions quicker. And it's more of an effective tool to understand key information. And this was reached on a global scale. And I don't think if impact wasn't a core priority of Microsoft, if I would even be able to reach that kind of potential, not only as an apprentice, but as an employee.
Yeah. No, and it's really key that you're able to kind of get involved and share those things. So if you were to launch a campaign, say around cultural diversity, what would be your topic of choice?
Right, so I did have a think about this, and Microsoft has resource groups. And what these resource groups are basically, for example, there's women at Microsoft, Black, Asian, minority ethnics, military, accessibility, Gleam. So there's already kind of a foundation for those networks, and everyone's applicable to join. So you don't need to just relate to the resource group. And they run multiple events, and I do think they do a really good job, and they probably cover topics I couldn't even think about. But if I really wanted to answer the question, I would say I'm quite passionate about women's safety in today's world. This was kind of brought to the forefront of my mind with the disappearance and death of Sarah Everard. I guess it just highlighted prevalent issues in the world that was already going on. But the way I would approach this, kind of linking back to the question about impact, to think how would I be able to make the most impact if I was launching this campaign, it would be going back to kind of working on the work of others. So building on the work of others to create a bigger impact. So I probably approach the women at Microsoft ERG resource group to kind of have that bigger impact, because they have the network, they've run the events. So that's probably how I would approach it.
That would be a fantastic campaign. And yes, women shouldn't feel scared to go out late at night or the way they dress. That's it. Yeah. We should be able to travel on the tubes, you know, on the trains, and feel kind of safe, and not always feel like we're, you know, looking behind our shoulder or you know. So that's a fantastic campaign, and yeah, I really hope you know, you're able to kind of get that off the ground. So yeah, that's a good one. So earlier you kind of mentioned that you can openly talk about your culture and your values. Obviously, I know you've only been at Microsoft for a short while, but has there ever been incidences like in the past where you haven't been able to openly talk about your culture and your values? I know at Microsoft you've got, you know, it sounds like a fantastic organization that really embrace all of this, but has there been any incidences where you've not been able to kind of be you?
Yeah, I think definitely previous to this employment, I have faced that. I think it's normal, it's kind of a rite of passage for anyone who is a minority ethnic. But I would say the way I've kind of faced this and overcome it would be kind of bridging that knowledge gap, because sometimes it's not on purpose. the other party may not even recognize that there's an issue at hand. So I guess it's my kind of duty to, like I was saying, be loud and proud with the right intentions of just informing the person, to kind of bridge that gap and give them that understanding.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah, so it's good to openly talk about things. So yeah.
Exactly.
So what practical advice would you give someone who wanted to develop their understanding of cultural diversity, would you say?
So similarly to me being loud and proud, it also helps when someone kind of asks questions respectfully, of course, and this kind of goes in that direction of acknowledgement and giving value to those topics, and that develops the allyship as well between both parties, because they're able to ask those questions and I'm able to answer, and it's kind of a win-win situation. As well as that, my manager gave me really good advice around this concept of vulnerability, and that vulnerability kind of builds trust. And if you start that open dialogue of a transparent conversation, this energy and attitude is most likely going to be reciprocated, that it kind of gives people a space to feel as if they can speak up, and it builds your rapport up. So I definitely would say they're my two key practical advices.
So Amani, you mentioned that you can openly talk about your cultures and values. You want to share with me how you do that?
Yeah, sure. So that kind of builds on the fact that it's a main culture and core priority of Microsoft. I would say an example of that is that we have monthly diversity and inclusion breakfasts with the wider team, and in those sessions we kind of address more taboo topics, such as privilege, covering allyship in the workplace. And I've never really worked at a company that works on diversity and inclusion consistently and actively. And I think it's super refreshing, and it's kind of allowed me to open my eyes to see the importance of it. And along with this, we also have sessions called Voice of the People, and that kind of focuses on the purpose of improving our working experiences and creating a safe environment where we can raise our opinions and experiences, ideas. And all of this is fed back to the leadership team. So it feels as if what we've said has been considered and is actioned at times as well.
That's really good. And it's good to be able to kind of share those experiences and breakfast events and, loud and proud. I love that, being able to speak about your culture. I know you're kind of in the month of Ramadan at the moment, and it's quite a significant kind of time for you as an individual. Do Microsoft kind of give you that time and space to be able to kind of, I guess you're fasting and be able to kind of respect that?
Yeah, definitely. Before Ramadan actually even started, there was a conversation in the wider team, and they kind of the director of the team asked if there's anything we can do to be accommodating. And then I also had a conversation with my manager as well, where she said I could even take some time off. And that was quite last minute as well.
Yeah.
It would have been something I would have planned. She also recommended if I did flexible hours and stuff like that. Really helps when you're fasting for 16, 17 hours.
Yeah,
So definitely very accommodating.
Yeah, I can imagine it being quite tough, and you're not even able to have any water, or you got to wait. Is it for sunset to open your?
Exactly. I will say though, because we're at home, it is easier because I'm used to actually going in, doing the commute, coming back. So
Yeah,
being in the comfort of my own home has made it easier in itself.
that's brilliant. Embracing our diversity, it starts not with just me or you. It starts with everyone. And so, what we want to do is we want to empower people to have that voice, to be able to be heard. So, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, and you've been a fantastic guest. Thank you, Amani.
Thanks, Nina.
We've got Kerr Lewis with us. Kerr is the co-chair of Kaplan's EDI committee. Kerr, welcome.
Hi, Nina.
Really pleased to have you as our guest today. So Kerr, tell me, you've just become a co-chair of, the the committee group, and what made you, become an EDI committee member and then move yourself up to co-chair? How did it all come about?
Well, thank you for the warm and lovely introduction. That's very nice of you. How I got involved in EDI is because, you know, equality, diversity, and inclusion is something that's been a feature of my training career and probably my whole life. In each of the companies that I've worked with and in, I've had involvement in trying to increase diversity and inclusion, and that was within retail, and that's carried through into training as well. So, I've got some background in working with special interest groups, underprivileged groups, so long-term unemployed, homeless, those with mental illness, people with special learning disabilities or special educational needs. So coming into Kaplan, it's just something that I naturally gravitate towards. And I think because I'm quite vocal in meetings, it wasn't a case of me joining the committee as a case of like everybody else stepping back and me being the only idiot stood forward and finding myself in it. And so that's probably the same case with co-chairing it as well, which again is something I'm very flattered to be doing, but it's just about just helping to steer things in a forward direction and just make sure everyone's heard, really.
Yeah. And I guess with your background and having so much kind of exposure to different kind of areas within diversity, which is fantastic, it brings kind of fresh ideas, I guess, to the committee and to the group. So what changes are you kind of looking to make in the near future, or are they already happening?
In regards to changes, there are things that are already set up and in place, and as being part of a group, I always just see my part as being of any team, which is to facilitate the completion of what's already been put in process. So there's several things that have been put in process already, and I'll be working my hardest to just ensure that those things are finished off. I think going forward, what I would like to see happen is to work more in collaboration with
Yeah.
other groups and other associations and other people who are doing similar work, so that we're not, it seems silly, but it's so that we're not working in isolation.
That's it.
You can get, that's the whole point about diversity, equality, and inclusion, which is bringing everybody in. And one of the benefits of doing that well is that you do get fresh ideas, and also you get solutions to problems that you may never even have envisioned.
Mm,
And so there's a good time saving there. You get
yeah.
the benefit of additional creativity, you get additional insight, and most importantly, you get to practice what you preach, which
Mm,
is you're creating inclusive spaces where people can thrive in because
yeah.
of their differences rather than in spite of.
Yeah, and the theme for World Day for Cultural Diversity this year is, dialogue and development, and it's very kind of key that we have those conversations. We're open, and we're able to discuss matters, as we see fit. So within the committee, if you were to give them say a theme to work on, what would that be?
Collaboration.
Collab-
I think that collaboration is the way forward. I think that I've always felt that way. I've always tried to work in collaboration with other groups because I don't have all of the answers, and why try and invent something that already exists.
Yeah,
And so I think like that collaboration, that wider collaboration, with the outside associations, creating that kind of internal collaboration to work with different departments, really helps people to connect the dots
yeah,
and to get on their agenda things that wouldn't ordinarily be on there. And I for me, that's always something that is very, very, very important, because when we could the when we think of when I think of diversity, equality and inclusion, it's about getting people to see the world from someone else's shoes.
Yeah.
And again, you can't do that in isolation. The studies show that when people mix with diverse groups, that any kind of feelings of anxiety or negativity dissipate and go down, because you're in close proximity with people. So the more people we can work with externally to the business and internally to the business, like, the better the overall benefit will be, and the nearer we come to kind of making that be more of the lifeblood within the business.
That's
Like,
it.
so that it's not just lip service, so that it's not just something that we tick a box. Diversity and inclusion isn't a box to tick. It's a approach to have.
Yeah.
And if we can demonstrate that and model that and show some of the fruits of that, I think, when people see something's working, they want to have a look and they want to find out what's going on, and they are drawn towards success rather than kind of us having to drive them towards a mind change. You don't change hearts and minds like that. So I think collaboration is the biggest thing for me. That's what I'd be pushing for. That's what I will be pushing for.
I think that's quite strong, and I think that's great to kind of work in collaboration. So what practical advice would you give our apprentices around inclusion and diversity?
Be curious. I think that it, like I say, especially where we've been trapped at home, in the house for long periods of time, it's easier to it can become quite easy when you're living in front of the screen to shut down yourself to new opportunities. And sometimes it's hard to think outside of your screen, let alone your box, right? Because you're sat at home all day long. But I'm a very curious person, and because of that curiosity, I now have friends all around the world, from Latvia to Australia to Sudan to to New York, and a friend who's recently moved to Iceland. And it's simply because when I pick up on some of the small details, I become curious.
Yeah.
Like, I had a colleague who was from Poland, and we were talking about Christmas, and I asked what's the traditional meal in Poland, and where it may not be true, but she informed me that it was fish. And
actually, I've heard that too. I've heard that too. It's the rich cultures that these diverse groups bring.
Yeah, that blew my mind.
Yeah.
Like, because I'm thinking, wow, imagine if in Poland they have a whole fish industry at Christmas time, like we have a turkey industry. Like, we've got cartoons about it. If someone in Poland watches a cartoon, a Tom and Jerry cartoon featuring them trying to chase a turkey, that must just look really bizarre to them.
Yeah.
Whereas if we saw a version about a fish, our minds would be blown. And so for me, like, that kind of curiosity, like, has caused me, just following that curiosity, caused me to ask a lot of questions, to gain a lot of insight, to kind of widen my perspective. And like I say, it's allowed me to have these friends and colleagues and associates from all over the world who give me this wide and interesting bits of information that it may not mean much at the time, but it comes back to you. You learn how to pronounce certain names in certain ways, or you become aware that you don't know how to pronounce a name. And so then you go and find out a way to go and pronounce the name. For example, there are whole websites dedicated to telling you how to pronounce words in foreign languages. It's quite easy. If there's a name that you don't recognize, you can just Google it. How do you pronounce insert name? And there's a website that will teach you how to do that. Like, how easy is that? My son recently started to play this game where he's asking Siri words in Mandarin, and he's then calling me these words in Mandarin. And so now I have to Google to find out if he's insulted me or not in another language. And we've done this in French and Russian and Mandarin. And on the one hand, it's slightly annoying because he could be saying something really mean. On the other hand, I'm a little bit impressed because he's forced me to learn
it's a new way of
elements
learning.
of three different languages, right?
Yeah.
And it's just about having that curiosity. So that's what I would say. Like, have curiosity and then just ask yourself the question and reach out.
Yeah.
And just follow that curiosity, because in doing so, you can end up in some weird and wonderful places. And you're transformed as much by going on that journey, and you in turn can help transform somebody else.
Brilliant. That's excellent advice. It leads me to say thank you so much, Kerr. It's been an absolute pleasure having you as our guest today. And I can't wait to kind of see what you've got coming up in our EDI group, and, you know, exploring more cultural events and foods and topics of conversation that we always have. It's just been brilliant. So thank you so much, Kerr.
Thank you very much, Lena.
And it's
Thank
been
you
a
for your
pleasure.
time. Thank you.